Okay, here we are in Chapter 54, the last chapter in the practices book. Okay, so this is about firing a system administrator, page 1005. Now, this is obviously a heck of a lot more complicated than firing an average employee. These are the people who have the keys to the kingdom. And if it's an adversarial firing, oh boy, I mean, you're going to have to jump through hoops to make this thing happen. So, companies often have procedures on how to, terminate an employee, but even that is not going to be sufficient when it comes to firing a system administrator. So, removing privileges against their will, essentially, is what we're talking about. The problem is, probably no one really knows all the systems that they have access to other than them. You would basically have to ask them, oh, by the way, could you make a list of everything you have access to? Oh, no particular reason. Just give me a list of all the places that you have administrator rights. Okay. So they first start talking about, cooperate with the human resources folks, page 1006. Normal rules may not apply here. You're going to have to do something different. Like, for example, you might want to call them into a conference room or call them at home or confront them at a cubicle and tell them what's going on, that kind of thing. So if you have a system administrator that's leaving on good terms, it is possible that you could have a scenario where you leave some permissions on them so that you could call them back the next week and say, hey, we're having some trouble here. That's possible. However, your HR people will most likely say, no, we cannot do that for legal issues and for liability issues. We just can't do it. I mean, once you leave the company, you're not really allowed to have any permissions on anything. So what you basically have to do is you have to remove their access during or before they leave. You really can't wait to after. All right, let me give you a scenario. Let's say we have a procedure where the HR people have to do something, and then the system administration team has to do something. They need to understand this is time critical. It's not like, oh, well, I'm sorry, Susie was out for the afternoon, so we didn't do anything. Like, no. I mean, you're going to have to call them in advance and say, we're getting ready to do this. Are you guys ready? Because when we pull the pin here, it's going to be seconds that count on getting all this stuff done, okay? They have to understand this is a priority. Because I have seen situations like that where we send the note to HR and say, okay, we need to get rid of their badge and, their keys and all the rest of the things that aren't directly related to IT. And they went, oh, yeah, well, I'm sorry, Susie wasn't here that day, so we didn't do that. Like, oh, man. Okay. So they just start talking about having an exit checklist, page 1007. Basically two parts. One part is for the, written by the HR people, right? That's fairly obvious stuff like gather their keys, that kind of stuff. And then the second part by the system administration folk, the IT folks that are left behind, okay? Sorry. All about disabling their access. So we're talking about, gathering their physical keys and physical key cards and badges and tokens and that kind of stuff. And then the accounts. This is the complicated part. If you have centralized accounts, right, some sort of a single sign-on thing, then disabling their account at the top, so to speak, basically shuts off their access to everything else. But unfortunately, not everything is centralized. I mean, a good example of a not centralized account system is the administrator access to a router. Okay, that's not connected to Active Directory. You're not using, your Active Directory name and password there. It's a separate thing. So yeah. So how about a Git repository? What about that Active Directory restore mode password? Remember that thing we talked about, how you type this password in one time during the install of your conversion to a DC, and then not ever use it ever again for years? I hope you got that written down. And what about, you have a database that has both the Active Directory style access to the database plus a separate SA account password? And again, that was set up one time when the database was installed years ago. So there's a lot of examples of where things are not centralized that you're going to have to go find. Okay. So they talk about removing access, page 1007. There's 6 basic categories. The physical one, those are easy. Change the combination on the cipher locks. Gather the physical keys. Perhaps even relock. Have somebody come in and rekey things. Proximity cards, things of that nature, badges. Just all that kind of stuff. Remote access. If you have any dial-in, and I don't really mean modem, although I guess that could exist as a backup somewhere. But VPN or secure shell, telnet, those kind of things. Any type of remote access is clearly the number one issue with somebody being pissed off and having to go home, where they just fire up their machine and get back in. Application level, like the database application, I mentioned that you could have configured the SQL Server, for example, to have a separate SA account and password. You could. Again, it's really helpful if you have single sign-on, because all I have to do is just whack that top thing, and then everything else is shut down. But that's just not the way it works. So, like, for example, the local SA account in SQL Server is not a part of Active Directory at all. And how would you even know? I mean, you'd have to go look. You probably don't even know if you have that feature enabled in SQL Server. You'd have to go look. Okay. Any shared passwords. So, for example, you might have like a shared password to a router or a cloud service or something. Let's say, for example, they use your account on Azure to build the Active Directory Azure thing, because it has to be connected to an account, okay? And so the company has this account, but you're the one who has the name and the password on it, okay? So, man, not only do you have to have your stuff, you need to be able to go to the cloud and figure out how to change passwords, okay? Which means I would have to know what their password is in order to change it. So what do you go up to Bob and say, hey, Bob, what's the Azure password? And he goes, why would you want that? You go, well, nothing. I was just, collecting passwords as a hobby, right? This is tough, isn't it? Okay, just saying. So it's pretty labor intensive to gather all these things together, particularly the ones that are, not centralized. So perhaps, and again, the person who really knows all the answers is probably the one you're firing, okay? So that's why you should probably have a team put together of system administrators who go through and try to figure out all this stuff. And it's going to take them a couple of days. So everyone else needs to be in on this project before the guy finds out, okay? So you're going to be gathering all the rest of the system administrators except for the one you're firing, and swear them to secrecy, and then get them working really hard on making a list of every single location where they think you might have access. Okay. External services. I mentioned, cloud services. That's kind of tough. Maybe you got a Dropbox account. Maybe you got a OneDrive kind of a thing. Maybe you've got, Git repository on the web. Those kind of things, right? These are extremely high priority because once the guy gets home and he's pissed, they're designed to be operated from home, right? All these things I just mentioned, Dropbox, OneDrive, those, they're all designed to be hit from home, okay? And then any certificates. If you have a code signing certificate, or you have for the company, or you have an SSL certificate for the web, there is a master password that's used for generating those certificates, okay? Somebody has to know what that is. I mean, could you imagine if your lead developer left and no one knew what the top secret password was for code signing? Ooh, that would be bad. Okay. So they talk about the logistics of it all on page 1011. Have a shared checklist of things to make sure that everyone sees what has been done and what has not been done. That way you don't do things twice and you don't leave anything out. In other words, here's the things we're going to do. It's, it's an orchestration kind of a thing. Step 1, step 2, well, maybe not steps, but here's all the things that need to be done. Here's the people that are going to be doing it. And then have a little check mark saying, okay, we did that, we did that, we did that, we did that. And share it out with the rest of the people that are playing this game, so they know what has been done and what has not been done. That way, everyone gets to see, not everyone, because certainly not the guy who's getting fired, but everyone gets to see everything else, and there's no skips and there's no duplication. Okay, so they get some examples of how this could work. They on page 1012, they have an amicable leaving a company, not getting fired, you're retiring or something. Okay, no ill will whatsoever. You could have them help do the interview for the incoming person. That would make a heck of a lot of sense. You know, you're the top dog, and you know all about the job more than anyone else, right? That would kind of make sense. Maybe even hire them, the replacement, in advance, if you could, to have them, you know, trail around the system administrator and make sure they had all that stuff. That would be fantastic. Make sure all the responsibilities are transferred before, you know, the actual termination date. You know, okay, you're now in charge of this, and, you know, go through it and make sure everyone understands. And then they themselves are going to disable the account themselves, you know, maybe with somebody present to witness it, but they're going to go in and disable their own account. Okay, good. And then in this particular case, there could be an oops moment where, you know, they call back a couple of days later and go, oh, you know, I forgot about that Git repository. You know, I'm sorry, I just didn't cross my mind. But yeah, somebody needs to go in. Here's the password. Somebody needs to go in and change it. So that works really well. That's also, hopefully, the way all of your termination of your system administrators go. Okay. And then it gets worse. There's one called firing the boss. That's probably the worst one. So you have a boss that's under suspension prior to some investigation, you know, pending some sort of investigation of some malfeasance, whatever. And this is the person who had all the keys to the kingdom, okay? And they're already suspicious. They're already suspended, thinking that they're going to get fired. Wow, okay? So every remote access thing is really something you need to be looking at. And they talk about how they planned this thing. What they did was they basically said, okay, tomorrow we're going to do this. And so they got together and said, okay, you guys, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to stay the night. After the boss leaves, you guys are going to have to stay the night and change everything. Wow. And so they did. They spent the entire night going through trying to figure out every single place they think that the boss had access and then changing it. And then they met in the morning to go through what they did, you know, like a brainstorming session of the checklist to make sure what else is there needs to be done. Okay. And they also talked about the whole concept of you could have everything almost ready, and then, you know, you march them down to the CEO's office, and they even talk about if it's like a 10-minute walk between their office and the conference room, during that 10 minutes that they're out of the office and walking down the hall, that's when everybody leaps into place and cuts the final chords on those accounts. I know it's really rough. Okay. They talk about removal at an academic institution. And they talk about how universities hire and fire people nonstop. At the end of every academic year, they're always getting rid of a professor or two and hiring another professor. So it happens a great deal. So they have a lot of practice, so to speak. And a small team to list all the access is probably good enough. And they do talk about, you know, the 10-minute walk to the office would be a perfect opportunity to give you time to disable their stuff. So on page 1014, they talk about basically the infrastructure rules. So obviously, having some sort of centralized password, single sign-on is clearly the way to go. It sure makes things easy when it comes time to pull the plug. Keep a list during the year, not talking about when it's time to fire somebody. Make and maintain a list of all those things that are not centralized. It ought to be known to everyone. All the SSAs need to know, here are all the locations where accounts are used that are not centralized. Don't wait till somebody gets fired to make this list, but just make it nonstop. Okay. Develop an exit checklist. Again, while you're in the okay scenario, not when you're trying to fire somebody. Be prepared to automate an awful lot of it, if at all possible. And then, you know, minimize the amount of remote access. Even, you know, don't have a bunch of you know, virtual private network scenarios. I mean, just kind of reduce them if at all possible. Okay, we've reached the end of this chapter and the end of this whole book, and we'll see you guys in the next video.